The morning Patricia Holloway's Lexus RX 450h made a sound that I can only describe as a sustained electrical protest, followed by a smell that drifted across 3 driveways and caused 2 neighbors to come out of their houses to look around. I was in my garage doing exactly what I had been doing every Saturday morning for 3 years, which was checking my home energy system logs over coffee while my Tesla charged on the schedule I had programmed. I heard the sound. I smelled the smell. I looked at my energy management display and confirmed that my system was operating normally, that my charger was drawing exactly the load it was designed to draw, and that nothing on my side of the property line was producing smoke or unusual electrical output. Then I walked to the end of my driveway. Patricia's Lexus was in her driveway 2 houses down, connected to a charging cable that she had purchased online 3 weeks prior after I had declined her request to share access to my charging equipment. The cable was connected to a standard household outlet that Patricia had apparently determined was sufficient for charging a plug-in hybrid vehicle. Smoke was coming from the outlet housing on her garage wall. Patricia was standing in her driveway with her phone in her hand, and an expression that I recognized as the specific expression of someone who had done something in the certainty that they were right, and was now processing evidence to the contrary. I said, "Patricia, you should disconnect that cable." She said, "Something's wrong with your charger." I said, "My charger is in my garage. That cable is connected to your standard outlet." She said, "You did something to your system." I said, "My system logs show normal operation. That outlet is not rated for continuous EV charging load." She said, "You set this up." I looked at her for a moment. Then I went back inside and pulled up my full system log for the morning, exported it to a PDF with timestamps, and emailed it to myself with the subject line, "System log, Saturday morning, all normal." Then I called my neighbor Greg Farris, who was one of the 2 who had come outside, and asked him if he had seen anything. He said he had been watching from his porch for about 10 minutes, and that the smoke had started from Patricia's outlet housing, and that he had not seen me near her property. I asked if he would be willing to write that down. He said, "Sure." My name is Calvin Morse. I am 43 years old, electrical engineer by training, currently working as a senior systems architect for a renewable energy company in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and homeowner for 4 years on Sycamore Glen Drive in a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas. I drive a Tesla Model Y, which I charge at home using a level 2 charger that I installed myself in my garage 4 years ago when I bought both the house and the car. The installation is permitted, inspected, and connected to a dedicated 60-amp circuit that I sized and installed to specification. I know a great deal about residential electrical systems. This becomes relevant. Patricia Holloway had been the Sycamore Glen HOA president for 2 years when this started. She was in her late 50s, drove the Lexus RX 450h plug-in hybrid, and had moved into the neighborhood 3 years prior from what I gathered was a larger house in a more expensive zip code, which she mentioned with enough frequency to suggest it was relevant to her self-image. She was organized, energetic, and had the specific management style of someone who had spent a career making decisions for other people, and found it difficult to understand why that authority did not extend to all situations in all contexts. She had been interested in my charging setup since she bought the Lexus. The first conversation had been casual, a driveway encounter 6 months after she moved in. She had asked about my charger, how it worked, whether it was difficult to install, what it cost to run. I had answered all of those questions because they were reasonable questions and because I liked talking about energy systems with people who were genuinely curious. She was genuinely curious in the way that people are curious about things they want. The second conversation had been a few weeks later. She had asked whether she could charge her Lexus at my station occasionally when her home charging was inconvenient. I had explained that my charger was a dedicated residential unit sized for my vehicle and my energy system, and that sharing it would complicate my charging schedule and my energy management. I had declined politely. She had said she understood. The third conversation had been less casual. It came in the form of an HOA letter, which arrived 3 weeks after the second conversation. The letter was on official board stationery, signed by Patricia as president, and it cited a provision in the Sycamore Glen HOA governing documents regarding shared community resources and the expectation that residents with specialized amenities consider community benefit when those amenities could serve a broader purpose. I read the letter twice to make sure I understood what it was saying. It was saying, in the language of HOA governance, that Patricia believed my private home charging station was a community resource that I should share with her. I called my HOA attorney, a woman named Sandra Fitch, who I had used for a previous property matter and who had a specific talent for cutting through bureaucratic language to the legal reality underneath. Sandra read the letter and said, "This is not a thing." I asked her to elaborate. She said the shared community resources provision in the governing documents applied to HOA-owned amenities like the pool and the community center, and that a privately installed charging station on private property was not a community resource under any reasonable interpretation of that language. She said the letter was either a misreading of the documents or an attempt to manufacture authority that did not exist. I asked which she thought it was. She said, in my experience, when an HOA president sends a letter like this, it is usually both. She wrote a response, clear, professional, 1 page. It explained that my home charging station was private property installed at my expense on my property, that the shared community resources provision did not apply to privately owned equipment, and that I was under no obligation to provide access to my charging station to any person. Patricia's response letter came back in 8 days. She thanked Sandra for the letter and said the board had reviewed its position and continued to believe that the community benefit principle applied to specialized amenities that were rare within the community, and that she hoped we could find a cooperative arrangement. Sandra sent a second letter. It said no. Patricia sent a third letter. It said the board was considering a formal amendment to the governing documents that would address the sharing of specialized amenities. Sandra sent a fourth letter saying that a governing document amendment could not retroactively require sharing of privately owned equipment, and that attempting to use HOA authority to compel access to private property would expose the board to significant legal liability. Patricia did not send a fifth letter. Instead, she began a different campaign. The campaign was low-grade and difficult to address directly because none of it rose to the level of a formal complaint. She mentioned my charging station at HOA meetings in ways that implied I was being unneighborly by not sharing it. She posted in the neighborhood Facebook group about the importance of EV infrastructure sharing as a community value, without naming me, in a way that several neighbors told me later they understood as being about me. She asked the HOA's property management company to inquire with the county about whether home charging stations required additional permits beyond the standard electrical permit, which they did not, but which resulted in a county inspector visiting my property and confirming that everything was properly permitted and compliant. I documented all of it. Then Patricia bought the charging cable online. I found out about the cable from Greg Farris, who had seen it delivered and had seen Patricia researching it on her laptop during a neighborhood gathering at which she had been vocally discussing the inadequacy of standard home outlets for EV charging, which was accurate information that she was apparently not applying to her own situation. The cable was a generic level 1 to level 2 adapter that was sold online with descriptions that implied it could convert a standard 120V outlet to provide level 2 charging speeds. This is not accurate. A standard residential outlet is a 15 amp or 20 amp circuit. Level 2 EV charging requires a dedicated 240V circuit rated for at least 40 amps, typically 50 or 60 amps for a proper installation. Connecting a plug-in hybrid to a standard outlet for the slow level 1 charging it could provide was technically possible but inefficient. Attempting to draw level 2 charging loads from a standard outlet was a different situation entirely, one that the electrical code addressed specifically and that any licensed electrician would refuse to enable. I did not know exactly what Patricia had purchased or how she intended to use it until the Saturday morning when I heard the sound and smelled the smell. I had suspected something was coming. I had documented my system logs daily for 2 weeks. I had sent myself a time-stamped email every morning confirming my charger's operational status. I had asked Greg to mention to me if he saw anything unusual at Patricia's house. I had done all of this not because I expected to cause her any harm, which I had not, but because I understood enough about residential electrical systems to know that someone who had been denied access to a proper charging setup and who had demonstrated a willingness to manufacture authority to get what she wanted might attempt a technical workaround, and that when that workaround failed, the failure would need to be clearly documented as originating from her equipment and her decisions, and not from anything on my side of the property line. The failure was documented. Greg's statement was in my inbox by noon. My system logs showed clean, normal operation from 3 in the morning to the present. The Lexus was on Patricia's driveway with a damaged outlet housing on her garage wall, her charging cable still connected to the compromised outlet, and an electrical repair bill that, I found out later from Greg, who found out from the electrician Patricia called, came to $940 for the outlet replacement, the circuit assessment, and the recommendation that she not attempt high-load charging from standard circuits. The electrician had apparently told her this at some length. Patricia called me that afternoon. She said, "Your charger interfered with my system." I said, "My charger logs show normal operation all morning. I have exported timestamps." She said, "Something you did caused this." I said, "Patricia, a standard 15-amp outlet cannot sustain level 2 charging loads. The circuit overloaded. That is a basic electrical principle." She said, "I want reimbursement for the repair." I said, "My equipment was not involved in your repair. I have documentation of that." She said, "I'm filing a complaint with the board." I said, "You are the board president. You would be filing a complaint with yourself." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was calling her attorney. I said I would make sure Sandra was available. I called Sandra. Sandra said she wants to claim your charger damaged her Lexus. I said I had full system logs and a neighbor witness statement. Sandra said, "Send me everything." I sent everything. Sandra reviewed it and called back in an hour. She said, "Calvin, your documentation is as clean as I have ever seen in a case like this. The logs are time-stamped, continuous, and show normal operation. The neighbor's statement is contemporaneous. There is nothing here that connects your equipment to her damage." I said I was aware of that. She said she is going to try anyway. I said I assumed so. She said, "Let her try." That was the end of part 1. Patricia's Lexus needed $940 of electrical repair that her own decisions had caused. My documentation was clean. Sandra was ready. And the HOA president, who had spent 6 months trying to manufacture authority over my private property, was about to discover that the paper trail she had built was going to look very different from the other side of a legal filing. Part 2 is where everything Patricia had put in writing came back to her. Patricia's attorney filed a demand letter on a Tuesday, 12 days after the outlet incident. The letter was sent by a man named Gerald Ross, who had a practice in Fort Worth, and who Sandra described after reading it as someone who had filed the letter without fully understanding the technical elements of the situation. The letter asserted that my home charging station had emitted an electrical surge that had traveled through the neighborhood's shared electrical infrastructure and damaged Patricia's vehicle charging system and the associated outlet. Sandra read it to me over the phone. When she finished, I said, "Gerald needs to understand how residential electrical systems work." Sandra said, "That is exactly what I intend to explain to him." She said the letter contained 3 technical assertions that were incorrect. First, that a level 2 home charger could emit a surge through shared infrastructure. Residential electrical systems in American neighborhoods do not share circuits between properties. Each home has its own service entrance, its own panel, its own circuits. A charger in my garage is on my circuits. Patricia's outlet is on her circuits. They are connected only at the utility transformer, and a charger operating normally within its rated parameters produces no surge at the transformer level. Second, that my charger had been operating abnormally. My logs showed continuous normal operation. The charger had drawn its standard programmed load on its standard schedule. There was nothing in 6 months of log data that suggested any abnormality. Third, that Patricia's damage was caused by an external source. An outlet that overloads from excessive load fails from internal resistance and heat, not from external surge. The damage pattern, which the electrician's invoice described in general terms, was consistent with overload failure and inconsistent with surge damage. Sandra sent her response the following week. It was 14 pages. The first 4 pages addressed the technical assertions with citations to the National Electrical Code, residential wiring standards, and a brief explanation of how residential electrical systems were configured that Sandra said she had asked a licensed electrician to review for accuracy before she sent it. The next 4 pages were the part I had been waiting for. They covered the full 6-month documentation of Patricia's campaign for access to my charging station, every letter, every HOA meeting reference, every Facebook group post, which Sandra had screenshotted and dated, the county inspector visit that Patricia had triggered, and the timeline that ran from Patricia's denied access request to her online purchase of the charging cable to the Saturday morning incident. Sandra's letter said that the timeline, taken as a whole, demonstrated that Patricia's outlet damage was the direct consequence of her own attempt to replicate charging capability she had been denied proper access to, and that any claim against my equipment was not only technically unsupported, but constituted a continuation of the documented pattern of bad faith conduct directed at my property. The final section was a counter-demand. Sandra had calculated the cost of my 6-month legal response to Patricia's HOA authority campaign. Letters, consultations, the county inspection response, the documentation and storage of system logs, and the current response to the demand letter. The total was $6,800. Sandra's letter demanded that Patricia dismiss her claim, reimburse my legal costs, and issue a formal written acknowledgement that my home charging station was private property not subject to HOA authority. Gerald Ross called Sandra 2 days after receiving the letter. Sandra told me the call had lasted 22 minutes and that the quality of Gerald's voice had changed significantly between the beginning and the end of it. She said he had started the call defending the technical assertions in his letter. She said she had walked him through the NEC citations and the residential wiring explanation, and he had gotten quieter as she went. She said by the end, he was asking about settlement parameters. Patricia had apparently not told Gerald the full history of the charging station dispute before asking him to file the demand letter. Gerald had been given the Lexus damage and the claim that my equipment was responsible and had filed accordingly. When Sandra's 14-page response arrived with the full 6-month timeline attached, Gerald had had a conversation with Patricia that Sandra described, based on Gerald's demeanor on the call, as a conversation that had not gone well for Patricia. Gerald said his client was reconsidering her position in light of the documentation Sandra had provided. Sandra said she appreciated that and noted the counter-demand remained open. He said his client disputed the characterization of the HOA letters as bad faith conduct. Sandra said the letters were in the file and spoke for themselves, and that a judge reviewing the full timeline would make of them what a judge would make of them. He said he would discuss with his client. He called back in 4 days. Patricia was willing to dismiss her claim. She was not willing to pay my legal costs or issue the written acknowledgement. Sandra said dismissal without the acknowledgement was not acceptable, because without the acknowledgement, the HOA could raise the same authority claim again in the future. Gerald said the written acknowledgement was too broad. Sandra said she would narrow it to a specific acknowledgement that the Sycamore Glen HOA had no authority over privately installed home charging equipment on individual properties, not a general concession, a specific factual statement about a specific class of equipment. Gerald came back in 2 days. Patricia would accept that language. The settlement was signed the following week. Patricia's claim was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could not refile it. My legal costs were split, with Patricia paying $4,200 and me absorbing the remainder, which Sandra said was a reasonable outcome given that some of my documentation costs had been precautionary rather than directly responsive to Patricia's claim. The written acknowledgement was recorded with the HOA board's official files, and a copy was filed with the county HOA registry. The acknowledgement said, "The Sycamore Glen Homeowners Association acknowledges that privately installed home electric vehicle charging equipment on individual residential properties within the community constitutes private property of the individual homeowner and is not subject to HOA authority, shared resource provisions, or community benefit requirements under the Sycamore Glen governing documents." 2 paragraphs, signed by Patricia as board president, notarized, filed. Sandra said that language is going to matter the next time an HOA president in this neighborhood gets an idea about someone's private equipment. I said I hoped the next HOA president read it carefully during orientation. She said, "Send it to them yourself." I did 2 months later, when the annual HOA board documentation was distributed to new members. I sent a copy of the acknowledgement to the full board with a brief note explaining its context and suggesting it be included in the standard new resident orientation materials. The current board, which included Patricia on paper, but which had developed a noticeably more collaborative approach in the months since the settlement, included it without comment. Patricia remained in the neighborhood for about a year after the settlement. She resigned as HOA board president 4 months after the agreement was signed, citing personal reasons, which Greg told me he understood to mean that the board had had a conversation with her about the legal exposure her conduct had generated. The new president was a man named Tom Wakefield who knocked on my door in his first week and introduced himself and said he had read all the board files and wanted to make sure we had a good working relationship. I made coffee and we talked for an hour. He was reasonable and direct and genuinely interested in running the HOA as a service to the community rather than a platform for personal priorities. We have had no significant disputes in the 18 months since. Patricia moved out the following spring. Her Lexus outlet had been repaired at her own expense, and I assume she found a proper level 2 charging solution wherever she went. I hope she did, not out of warmth, but out of the genuine belief that proper electrical infrastructure is safer for everyone than improvised solutions, and that the $940 lesson she had received about the difference between a standard outlet and a dedicated charging circuit was the kind of lesson that was cheaper to learn once than twice. I still check my energy management logs every Saturday morning. The logs remain clean. The charger runs on its programmed schedule. The Tesla charges overnight on off-peak rates the way it has for 4 years. The documentation folder for the charging station dispute is in my home office filing system, organized chronologically, with the settlement agreement and the recorded acknowledgement at the front. I do not expect to need it again, but it is there if I do. Here is what I think about when I look at that folder. Patricia Holloway spent 6 months trying to access equipment she was not entitled to access. She wrote letters, invoked HOA authority, triggered a county inspection, posted in neighborhood social media, and finally purchased an electrical product she did not fully understand and used it in a way that the National Electrical Code and basic physics predicted would fail. Every step of the way, I documented what she did. Not because I was planning to sue her, because documentation is what I do. Because 20 years of working in electrical engineering and energy systems has made record-keeping a professional habit that I applied to my personal situation the same way I would apply it to a work project. Date everything, export the logs, get the neighbor's statement, keep the emails. When the situation required a legal response, the documentation was already complete. Sandra did not have to reconstruct what had happened. She had it all in order with timestamps. That is the lesson I take from this more than anything about HOA authority or charging station rights, or what happens when a standard outlet meets a level 2 load. The lesson is that documentation is not a reaction to a problem. It is a practice you maintain before the problem, during the problem, and after it. And the value of it is that when the problem becomes a legal matter, your attorney calls you back in an hour and says your documentation is as clean as she has ever seen. That call felt very good. Build the practice before you need it. Date everything. Export the logs. Drop your thoughts below. If an HOA or a neighbor has ever tried to claim access to something you own privately, tell me about it. And if someone in your community is eyeing your private equipment with a community benefit argument, check your governing documents and call an HOA attorney before you need one. Because the acknowledgement that prevents the next dispute is easier to get before the first demand letter than after it. End of part 2, approximately 6,900 words. Thumbnail text. She demanded my Tesla charger. Her DIY solution fried her Lexus instead.